A possible US-Iran deal to end the conflict is taking shape. While mediators try to bridge some critical divides, Israeli officials are reportedly worried. What are their concerns, and will they throw a spanner in the works? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. A ceasefire on the 8th of April brought to an end more than 5 weeks of fighting between the US and Iran. Since then, mediation efforts led by Pakistan have laboured to bridge the differences between the two sides. And now it appears some have been resolved. There's hope for an agreement that would end the conflict, a conflict which has caused an unprecedented global energy crisis. But there are also concerns. A major one is how the US's ally Israel would respond to a deal with Iran. What are the Israeli concerns? Could it, as Tehran fears, undermine the progress in the negotiations? We'll raise these questions with our panel of guests when they join us shortly. But first, Ferdia Carr has our report.
Teasing a possible end to the war with Iran, US officials have again said that an agreement is close. The latest proposal would reportedly see the Strait of Hormuz reopened and the ceasefire extended to allow for talks on limiting Iran's nuclear program.
We have what I think is a pretty solid thing on the table in terms of their ability to open up the straits, get the straits open, enter into a very real, significant, time-limited negotiation on the nuclear matters, and hopefully we can pull it off. It has a lot of support in the Gulf.
Publicly, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been supportive of Washington's efforts, saying he and President Donald Trump agreed that any final agreement with Iran must eliminate the nuclear danger. That would mean dismantling Iran's enrichment sites and removing the enriched nuclear material from its territory. Privately, Israel has reportedly been pushing the US to continue the war since April, when the ceasefire came into effect, saying it wants to further degrade Iran's military. And Israeli media have quoted several officials saying the current proposal is bad for Israel. There are fears Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz will allow it to negotiate from a position of strength and rebuild its arsenal.
The prevailing view within the Israeli military is that Trump's decisive moment is approaching, either a deal or a strike. Israel fears that once the aircraft carrier is withdrawn from the region and the World Cup kicks off, Trump won't return to war, while Iran will exploit that to buy time in negotiations and rebuild its missile and nuclear capabilities.
And there is skepticism from Iran that Israel will abide by any deal.
As you're aware, the Zionist entity are doing their best to undermine the agreement, and we do expect to see some actions by Israel to torpedo the entire negotiating process. Nothing is ruled out.
Netanyahu says Trump has affirmed Israel's right to defend itself from, quote, threats on every front, including Lebanon. But there are also fears in Israel that a US-Iran deal could demand that Israel halt its military actions against Hezbollah. Israel is adamant the group poses a threat to its national security. President Trump has previously said Netanyahu will, quote, do whatever I want him to do. But the Israeli Prime Minister is heading into elections in October, accused of failing to deliver on any of his promises of victory against Iran, Hezbollah, or Hamas in Gaza. And Netanyahu may face a difficult choice: backing Trump's deal or satisfying an Israeli public and security establishment that still wants to see Iran weakened further. Ferdia Carr, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
There continue to be fast-moving developments, but we have the right panel of guests to make sense of them all for us. From Tel Aviv, we're joined by Mairav Zonszein. She is a senior Israel analyst at the International Crisis Group. In London, Yossi Mekelberg, a senior consulting fellow with the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House. And with me here in the studio, Paul Musgrave, Associate Professor of US Government at Georgetown University in Qatar. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today on Inside Story. Paul, let me start with you, and let's go back to the start of this. And I don't actually mean February the 28th when the war started. I want to take you back, and we know about this from some reporting by the New York Times, to a couple of weeks before that, when Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Washington, D.C. He went to the White House. He went to the White House Situation Center. The amazing detail here is apparently he sat in the Commander-in-Chief's chair, Trump's seat, and explained why there needed to be a war. Netanyahu was the architect of all of this, was he not?
Well, Netanyahu, I think, was pushing on an open door. There were a lot of elements in the United States for their own reasons who wanted to have this war, but the Israeli support and the Israeli timing of this certainly helped shift this to being an American war as well as an Israeli one. And we also saw this happen last summer when the United States joined Israel's war against Iran over the summer against the strikes in Fordo and Natanz. And so I think that the United States had its own reasons for this war, but certainly the Israeli pressure and the way that this war began really had a lot to do this with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And then, of course, a lot of elements in the American administration right now are eager either to join with Israel or, for others, to blame Israel for everything that's gone wrong with what was supposed to be a short, happy, victorious war for President Trump.
Yossi, I mean, we've heard also during this war from some former officials in previous administrations, like former Secretary of State John Kerry and former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, among others, who say that Netanyahu has been pushing for this when they were in office. He's been pushing for this for literally years and years and years with every single administration, and Trump was the only one that gave him what he wanted.
Absolutely. I mean, this was his thing for more than 20 years. He always wanted to be seen as the protector of Israel, the defender of Israel, and the central to it, in his opinion, was Iran, removing the nuclear threat as he saw it from Iran, let alone, the support of the proxies, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas and others in the region. So, and I agree with the previous speaker, at the end of the day, here came an administration where it was susceptible to listen to this and was ready to act and believe that there is an easy military solution to this. And, we started the war talking about few days, and then it happened, turn into weeks and months. And then even now, when I'm sure we'll talk about it, we are not so sure actually what is negotiated, if it's another 60 days of ceasefire, if it's a peace agreement, as Trump says on his social media platform. So this is, now we are standing into something that Netanyahu can actually shows very, very little, and this is only a few months before election.
Mairav, so that was the beginning of the war. Almost 3 months later, where we are now, with this deal sitting on the table, not yet signed. If it is signed, is this Netanyahu's worst nightmare?
Well, we really don't know what this is going to look like. And right now, what it looks like is just an extension of a ceasefire. And in Lebanon, that's still very precarious. But yes, the way that the news has been developing the last few days, and also it's not just the news of a potential deal, it's the strategic failure of this war. The goals of the war, which have been fudged somewhat from regime change to maybe conditions for regime change, which focus less on the nuclear program this time around and focused more on ballistic missiles. None of those goals have really been achieved. Netanyahu cannot talk about a victory in Iran. He can talk about the erosion of certain capabilities, but those have a certain timeline. So it's basically a strategic disaster, I think. And Trump expected something different and didn't get it. And now he has to deal with the pieces of it, and he has a global economy to worry about. Israel is somewhat insulated from that. And yes, I think that this deal, whatever it will be, might be the least bad scenario, but it should be said this is a bad scenario for Israel's strategic interests. It doesn't look good. It makes Iran assert power, not just in the Strait, but in the region. And so it is almost a nightmare scenario for Netanyahu, yes.
Yossi, as you said, for Netanyahu, Iran has been the overriding project for literally decades, before he's even prime minister. Has it always just been about Iran, or has it been focusing the international community on Iran so that they ignore the Palestinians?
I think, it was a standalone to a large extent Iran. That's, some of the concerns, Israeli concerns vis-a-vis Iran are real. It's the question, how do you deal with that? And, I think not only starting from the few weeks before the war, I would start from the pressure on the first Trump administration, the misguided pressure on Trump first administration to withdraw from the JCPOA. What we realized, the situation got way worse in terms of uranium enrichment, that Iran was marching much closer to the ability to acquire some capability to be warheads, nuclear warheads. So that's where it's, in many ways, if you look, where the biggest mistake is the withdrawal from the JCPOA, that Netanyahu was the architect. And this was, whether they support Hezbollah, support of Hamas, that in a strange way Netanyahu supported as well, is the financing of Hamas. But there are other agendas in Israel, which is also, eventually we see, step by step, talking about also the Palestinian issue, annexation of the West Bank. And when he formed the current coalition, of course, they have a much bigger agenda than Iran, building more settlements, making sure there is no Palestinian state in the foreseeable future, and eventually probably the annexation. This is part of the bigger agenda. And if this same coalition, and probably not, but wins the forthcoming election, this might become real.
Netanyahu was able to persuade Trump at the start of the war. They have a relationship, but not always a particularly close relationship. There have been disagreements. Trump said Netanyahu let him down when Israel pulled out of the 2020 US operation to assassinate Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. 5 years later, Trump suggested the US could take control and redevelop the Gaza Strip. He reportedly didn't consult Netanyahu beforehand. In June the same year, Trump lashed out at Israel for violating a ceasefire agreement with Iran, saying officials don't know what they're doing, and he used an expletive there as well. There was also frustration in the White House with Israel's stalling of the implementation of the Gaza ceasefire. Paul, difficulties here for Netanyahu. He has a lot of influence in Washington, but it's very hard to criticize President Trump.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. It's much easier for folks like Senator Lindsey Graham or Senator Ted Cruz to criticize policy or criticize particular advisors than it is for them to forthrightly criticize President Trump. President Trump reads his own media. He looks to guidance on social media, in the press, and he wants to see people praising him to know that they're loyal. The best way to talk to President Trump is to cast yourself as the most loyal ally of President Trump. And you're going to see folks who are taking the pro-Netanyahu side. I don't even want to say the pro-Israeli side, because I do agree with the other guests that Netanyahu's strategy here has been an absolute disaster. It's been a generational project that has now failed. And I think that you're going to see folks who are more allied or more pro-Netanyahu working in order to convince President Trump that they have the correct Make America Great Again policy. I think that's going to be a tough sell. If you look at what President Trump is saying on social media, he's now asking for all countries to sign on to the Abraham Accords, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar. That does not sound like somebody who is placing Israel's priorities ahead of anyone. But I think there's also a window here for folks who are in the pro-Likud, pro-Netanyahu camp to use this time as we go through days and weeks without an actual signature or a final agreement to pick away at this agreement and try to show all of the different flaws. And that might ultimately end up in some place where the prime minister, who is looking toward the elections, who wants to have something to rescue what I think a lot of people in Israel recognize has been a disastrous outcome. And they're suffering with this every day. Every time I open Haaretz, I see another headline about an incursion into northern Israel, drones and other incursions. I think that you're going to see a lot of effort trying to undermine this, and that could be one way that diplomatically this agreement, the efforts toward this agreement, could be spoiled.
Mairav, if I can turn to you, we're talking all about Prime Minister Netanyahu, and obviously he has been the dominant figure in Israeli politics for so long, the longest serving Prime Minister in the country's history. But just give us a snapshot of what overall Israeli public opinion is about the moment we find ourselves in now.
Well, Israeli public opinion is a bit nuanced and hard to kind of understand. It's a bit of a paradox. The Israeli public is very upset with Netanyahu. They were that way before October 7th. They're certainly that way after October 7th. He has not been polling well, and yet he's the only prime minister that they believe can actually be the most fitting prime minister in Israel. They still have a hard time because there's no other leader with any kind of political power or charisma that he has. That being said, Israelis in general are very aligned with Netanyahu, and not just Netanyahu, many of the politicians in his government to some extent, on the Palestinian issue, on using military force in Lebanon, on the issue with Iran. I mean, you had huge amounts of support, certainly for the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and you still do, and also for the war in Iran. Even when Israelis were sitting in shelters, kids were at home, people were not being able to make a living for a while, you had huge amounts of support, and then that support slowly did wane as Israelis started to realize that this wasn't going to end up in a necessarily a better spot. So Israelis, I think, are unhappy with the situation, but the previous speaker said that they understand it's a disaster. They might understand that there's a failure here, but that isn't translating into a different trajectory, a different plan, a different politics. Especially in Lebanon, for example, the people who live close to the border there, they want Israel to go all the way. They want them to bomb Beirut. They want them to occupy possibly parts of Lebanon further. So it's not translating into a different approach, more diplomacy. It's actually translating into more and more military force.
Yossi, there is an electoral backdrop to all of this, midterm elections in the US, but in Israel, there are supposed to be general elections. The Knesset has been dissolved, and by the 27th of October, there are supposed to be general elections. That clearly is an important factor, particularly for Prime Minister Netanyahu, because he's still facing charges. If he's not in office, potentially, he could end up in jail. Is that right?
Yeah, first of all, elections are not about the future of Netanyahu, and I think that's what the voters should remember. That probably the most consequential election in Israeli history, definitely in recent history. So yes, he's still facing corruption on 3 cases of corruption. Every day, including today, he finds a reason to shorten the time he gives evidence in court. It delays. This is something that happens, since the early investigation. We are talking about around 9 years. And that's the idea, that is the longer that they procrastinate on this trial, something would happen, and the war was supposed to help him. The reality is, at the end of the day, there is probably on the table some process that can be pardoned by the president, but he will have to leave politics. I don't know if he's going to take it, but at the end of the day, the Netanyahu era must come to an end. Whether we call it a failure or disaster, Israel and Israelis are much worse off as a result, definitely in the current term of Netanyahu, and I don't think Israel can tolerate another 4 years of that. So they need to start thinking, even if they don't think there is someone that with his charisma and very smooth English, they need to think beyond Netanyahu, and someone that actually, even when there are tactical achievements in the battlefield, can actually translate it into something diplomatic that ensures their long-term security.
Paul, we don't have a deal yet, and it's not clear whether we will get a deal. Even if we do get a deal on the current contours that we've heard about, it's then going to be a long, drawn-out process, timelines, 2 different timelines, 30 days and 60 days, lots that could go wrong, very fragile situation. That gives Israel some opportunities, if it doesn't like this, to try and advocate against it, maybe even sabotage it.
I think that there's going to be a lot of elements in the United States and Israel and Iran that will, for their own reasons, want to pursue their objectives by trying to get a better deal, scrap a deal altogether, and that does give people an opportunity. Those opportunities could be diplomatic. They could involve Lebanon. It's absolutely correct that there is a continuing Israeli support for more bellicose, more warlike policies. Netanyahu's policies are rarely the issue. His decisions, his personal character, his corruption, those are galvanizing issues. But on the policies, there's a huge security coalition. In the United States, how that could play out is also using connections in Congress, in the media, and other ways in order to demonstrate to Americans flaws or gaps or concessions in this deal. And when you have folks like the Wall Street Journal editorial board describing this as capitulation, well, those are strong words. Those are the sorts of words that you use if you want to sink a deal. The question for everybody is going to be simply the question that President Trump has to confront on his own, which is, what is the alternative? There's not many levers left for the United States. And so even if Israel commits some sort of act of violence, some sort of escalation, if there's some sort of provocation, how is Trump going to respond? We could have a much rockier road, but I think that the way that the strategic situation has evolved, especially with the Strait of Hormuz becoming, for the first time, a live issue in these debates. It's not just about nuclear weapons, but now about global trade. It's going to be very hard to scupper this. That doesn't mean that people won't try. And every week, every month that goes by harms folks in the United States, harms folks in Iran, harms folks in the GCC and the Arab countries, and of course it harms the people who are the customers for natural gas, fertilizer, and all the other elements that are at stake here economically.
Mairav, I mean, Israel has been known in the past to do unexpected, bold military operations. They even bombed where we are, Doha, the capital of Qatar. Do you think unilateral action by Israel is something that can be ruled out or not at this stage? Because, of course, you've got two different theatres of war. You've got Iran, where there's a lot of US presence still. There's two aircraft carriers and all the associated aircraft that are there. But also you've got Lebanon, where Israel is basically running its own war.
You've got more theaters than that. You have Israeli troops in Syria, you have Gaza, you have the West Bank. But yes, I mean, you're right that, Israel cannot act alone in either Iran or Lebanon without the U.S. okay. That doesn't mean that there aren't murky areas. I mean, the Lebanon issue is a sensitive and an interesting one because Hezbollah has its own power. The Lebanese government is very much intent on some kind of de-escalation and diplomacy, but it has very little power. And so Israel can go in there and, it can say, as Netanyahu tried to in a statement just yesterday or the day before, that we have freedom of operation there. So even if there is a ceasefire, and we've seen that the ceasefire is not really a ceasefire, and not only is Israel striking, also Hezbollah is killing soldiers with drones on an almost daily basis or injuring them. And so that's a real actual problem for Israel, and it will want to naturally escalate, and it feels constrained by Trump to do so. But in that, Israel is occupying southern Lebanon, a million things could happen there that could be perceived and projected by Trump and Netanyahu together as something that could be undermining Iran's desire to link the two arenas. And largely Iran has successfully linked those arenas. But what I'm saying is that Netanyahu can find ways to do so, but he won't do it without Trump's okay or without Trump and Netanyahu agreeing on that. And I'll say on that all this reporting of tension and friction between the two, every time this happens, it usually is followed by some kind of seamless coordination between Trump and Netanyahu in the region. So I would very much take with a grain of salt all these reports. There's clearly officials who are interested in putting out a display of friction. I think it's not just that Netanyahu and Trump are aligned on Iran, but there are elements within the American government that have for years very much been pro-Netanyahu and have strategic interests in Israel continuing to be this ally. So it's really not about any kind of friction between them.
Yossi, with Israel, it seems, opposing the current peace deal, does this not also add to a situation where increasingly, globally, and including with many of Israel's old European allies, that Israel is seen as a diplomatic pariah? You have Gaza, you have the West Bank, you have the recent death penalty that will only apply to Palestinians, and the scenes recently of all those Europeans being arrested after the flotilla was intercepted.
There is no doubt that the reputation of Israel, whether here in the UK or in the rest of Europe, those are friendly countries, but the reputation suffered huge blows in the last 2.5 years. You see the beginning of all of it. After October 7, everyone supported Israel. Everyone, almost every prime minister or president came to visit Israel. And since then, because of the way that Israel conducted the war, in Gaza, killing more than 70,000 people, and then everything happened. And as you mentioned, what happened in the last week, that a minister of national security behaves in a complete thuggish way, in an unacceptable way for official representative of the state of Israel, encouraging what looks, at least allegedly, an abuse of activists that, you know, they might feel that to the Israelis they're a nuisance, but you can completely treat them very differently. And I think it will take for the diplomatic service many years to recover the reputation of Israel, but it will require first and foremost that Israel will change its policy in all fronts. One thing is to have a strong military capability to protect yourself, and another is to continue to have only one modus operandi of using it, and excessively and disproportionately.
Paul, I mean, that's a diplomatic global picture, but traditionally Israel's always had its secret weapon, which is its support in the US and the US Congress. Now, there are some very strongly backing Israel now, but the president's own party is split in a way it hasn't been in the past.
That's absolutely right. We're beginning to see much more friction within the Republican and conservative movement over how Israel should be regarded. And for years, a generation more, the bipartisan support in the United States for Israel was a major way that folks like Prime Minister Netanyahu could influence and get what they wanted to some degree from the United States. That has frayed significantly. One of the reasons why I do suspect that you're going to see both allies of Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu in Washington and elsewhere try to make a big push over the coming months is because until this autumn, there's going to be a strong Republican majority in the Senate and a decent-sized Republican majority. It's very small, but it's been cohesive enough on this issue regarding Israel. But that might go away. And so once you have those kinds of time pressures in which perhaps after November, January, the new Congress sits, you might have a very different situation, then you start to look at how to make up gains in the short term. And those gains could come for backing something that might be rash, that might be transferring U.S. support from Iran to Lebanon in a way that backfires for U.S. efforts to broker a peace in this region. But you could very much see people trying to use their strategic assets right now before those go away, because the shifts in public opinion regarding Israel in the United States are real.
Paul Musgrave, Mairav, Zonszein and Yossi Mekelberg, thank you for joining us on Inside Story today. Stay with Al Jazeera for coverage of the current peace efforts. And remember, for more detailed context and analysis, take a look at our website, aljazeera.com. Your comments are always welcome. Leave them on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or on X, you can find us at AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, James Bays, and the team here. Remember, Al Jazeera's coverage continues around the clock. Stay tuned for the very latest.